We're going to hear from three highly qualified experts about the situation in Taiwan, and then I will moderate and ask some questions perhaps, and also pass along your questions to them. So we're streaming live on the Weatherhead East Asian Institute's Facebook page, which I guess you're already on, or you wouldn't be hearing me, but that would be at Facebook.com/Weatherhead East Asian Institute, one word, Weatherhead East Asian Institute. And you can put your questions in the comment section under the broadcast, and the staff of the Institute will pass those questions on to me so that I can throw them at the panelists. So what I'm going to do now is to introduce our first person who's informing us and hear from him, and then I'll give the introduction to the second person rather than introducing everybody all at once. So the first person who's going to speak with us is Dr. C. Jason Wang, who is the director of who is at Stanford University, where he's the director of the Center for Policy, Outcomes, and Prevention, and associate professor of pediatrics and medicine, and of health research and policy at Stanford. He has his medical MD degree from Harvard Medical School, as well as a PhD in policy analysis from RAND. He is an expert on healthcare in Taiwan. He was project manager for Taiwan's healthcare reform task force starting in the year 2000, and has many other distinguished credentials, and has done a number of publications already on the COVID-19 crisis. So we want to hear from Dr. Wang about how Taiwan has managed the public health response to the pandemic and the lessons of Taiwan's policies for the rest of the world. Thank you, Dr. Wang, very much for joining us.
Thank you very much for inviting me, Andy. So just to remind people, so Taiwan is a democratic country about 80 miles off the coast of China. It has 23 million people. And of the 23 million, about 1 million people actually either work or live in China. And so in 2019, there are also about 2.7 million visitors from the mainland that had traveled to Taiwan. So there's a lot of exchanges between the Taiwanese and the Chinese in the mainland. So this particular pandemic started around the time of the Lunar New Year's, where hundreds of millions of people were expected to travel. And so it's particularly dangerous, setting up a perfect storm for a viral spread. And so how did Taiwan manage to curb the spread of the virus? Now, I think part of it is because of their experience in SARS in 2003. So during that time, there were a lot of panic during SARS, and there were 73 deaths for that particular epidemic, and 346 cases of SARS. 94% of the known infections were transmitted inside the hospitals. And all major hospitals were either fully or partially shut down during SARS. Doctors and nurses quit for fear of catching the disease because of inadequate hospital infection control during SARS. And fever clinics were set up too late outside of the hospitals to prevent infection in the waiting rooms. And there was one infected laundry worker at one of the hospitals that became a super spreader. And for that hospital, the Hoping Hospital, the entire 450-bed hospital was shut down, and 930 staff and 240 patients were locked in there. It was a lockdown of the hospital. And even patients or families who were supposed to be in quarantine evaded isolation because they thought they were getting incarcerated. So these were the things that were happening during SARS. And so there were a lot of important lessons learned, including how do you convince people that quarantine is necessary? It's a civil society, so you have to have a discourse. And it's also a democracy where you have to make everything legal before you could implement it. It pays attention to social justice, so you have to really make sure what the government is asking people to do that is in fact just and fair. And so there were a lot of discussions after that. Starting the year after, in 2004, Taiwan started to amend the Communicable Disease Control Act. And some of the things that they did were that they require a stockpile of protective equipment for healthcare workers in all the hospitals and also within the government. They need to keep a stockpile. It allowed the creation of a National Health Command Center where 3 different commands were integrated into one command, including the Central Epidemic Command Center. And it allowed the regulation of gatherings, entry and exit of people, traffic, evacuation, and travel restrictions. Furthermore, it specified penalties for violating home quarantines and isolation regulations, hoarding of resources, disseminating rumors or incorrect information during a crisis, fine institutions for employees' bad behaviors if they were to break protocol because it's dangerous. It allows for trafficking and management of people under infectious risk, and mandates the geographic location and total number of patients to be made public, for example, at a county level. So you need to know this county has how many cases, that county has how many cases. It allows the use of public properties and requisitions use of private productions to make medical devices necessary to fight the pandemic, including pharmaceuticals for disease control. So all these measures were amended all the way until 2019 last year. And in fact, they had a special act in 2020 just to make sure that they have everything that they need across different sectors of society to mount an effective response against the virus. So let me tell you a little bit about the National Health Command Center that was created in 2004. This particular command center is located on the 7th floor of Taiwan CDC in the Ministry of Health and Welfare. And it includes the Central Epidemic Command Center, the Biological Pathogen Disaster Command Center, and the Counterterrorism, Bioterrorism Command Center, all in one. It could host 100 people. It has data analyst rooms. It has, in the data center, different types of data, including media data, coming from the local governments, from the central governments, also international news. It has conference rooms for people to meet. It has a press room, so you could actually inform the public as you find out things. Decisions are made based on the data that were analyzed. And also there's a lounge where people could rest because it's a 24/7 operation. So it's a compound that could host 100 people where all the data basically becomes integrated into the central nervous system, if you will. And then it gets disseminated into the rest of the country. The other thing that I think Taiwan did this time during COVID-19 that was very important is early recognition of the crisis. So when there were chatters in the internet or also through informal communications between Taiwan and China that there is a new coronavirus, as early as January 1st, Taiwanese health officials were boarding onto the flights that were coming from Wuhan to check for people, passengers, for symptoms of cough or sore throat or pneumonia, and to see if they had fever. So they were boarding on the flights, checking on the passengers before they let them disembark. And so as early as January 20th, they activated the National Health Command Center. So what that means is that it gives government special powers under the legislation to fight the epidemic at the time, and now it's a pandemic. They actually also had a National Security Council meeting convened the next day to make sure that if they need to help the small businesses that were affected or people under quarantine, that it's between different agencies of government, that there's a coordination. On January 22nd, they start to cancel the entry permits of tourists coming from Wuhan. And then they basically, with the exception of one individual who was sick already, that stayed in Taiwan for treatment, the tourists were asked to leave the country because Taiwan had to figure out how many people are already infected. And then on January 27th, they integrated the immigration and customs database with the National Health Insurance database. And the way it was done was they took the 14-day travel history from the immigration and customs data, sending batch files to the National Health Insurance database. So when a doctor is seeing a patient, he or she will know that this person just came from Wuhan or other epicenters, and will say, "Oh, you just came from Wuhan. Where else did you go?" So ask more detailed travel history. Put on a gown and a mask, make sure they wear protective equipment, and just do a more careful exam and maybe order a COVID-19 test. So this allows the clinician at the point of care to have data on, formulating their differential diagnosis to treat the patient. And that turns out to be also very important. This data set also then allows later on to retest people if they continue to have pneumonia and didn't get better, and then you could actually ask them to get tested for COVID. The other thing that they did with the technology is that when somebody is landing in an airport in Taiwan, and as you know, airport is very busy, it's not a good place to hang out. So you want to triage them quickly. And when there are a lot of passengers, how do you do this? So you triage them by risk levels. So they had a QR code where you could scan. The QR code leads you to an online declaration form. And then you fill out, your travel history. And then you fill out any symptoms you might have, cough, fever, sore throat, pneumonia. And then also your contact information. And so those who had really low risk, no symptoms, no relevant travel history, will send a pass through a text message so they could exit the airport quickly. Those that had been traveling to level 3 alert areas, you need to pay more attention. So they need to be, quarantined. And if those folks also had been in direct contact with COVID-19 patients, they need to do self-isolation. And so this way they were able to triage people. And so this is on top of the data integration between customs and immigration and national health insurance data. By the way, that integration only took 1 day to accomplish. And this is a very effective health system. 1 day to send the batch files. And the other thing about what Taiwan had done correctly and well this time is in the management of the crisis. So in a crisis like this, you really need to manage and assess your capacity and allocate resources equitably across society. So on January 20th, the government did a quick count of the stockpiles and informed the public. There are 44 million surgical masks, 1.9 million N95 masks, and 1,100 negative pressure isolation rooms. So this is January 20th. So everybody in Taiwan did a quick math. 44 million surgical masks, 23 million people. Oh, less than 2 masks per person. So then the government says, okay, you know what that means? That means we cannot export outside of Taiwan. We have to make more. So right now we're going to ban export of masks for now. So they start to ramp up production from 2.4 million units a day to over 12 million units a day. And so this is accomplished within 3 to 4 weeks. Currently, I think they are close to 15 million mass production per day. And now they are donating to countries in need. I believe they've now donated also close to 50 million masks outside of Taiwan, including the United States and many places in Europe and South America. Now, in order to do this, it's not easy to all of a sudden ramp up production of masks from 2.4 million to over 10 million a day. So what they did was they quickly realized that there are 3 layers to the mask. The inner layer that touches your face that needs to be soft, the middle layer that has the protective filter, and the outer layer that needs to be water resistant, right? So they sourced the materials where the the raw materials are coming from and who are the companies making them. So they basically asked for their help and identify those vendors immediately. And they set up production lines and they asked for volunteers. So competitors working together to build 60 production lines in 3 weeks. And so this made it possible to then hand out the mask to the public. So right now, if you're in Taiwan, if you're a kid going to school, you get 10 masks for every 2 weeks. Okay, so that means every school day you have a new mask. And if you're an adult, you get 9 masks for every 14 days. And people would use their national health insurance card to pick up their masks. And it's 20 cents a piece. In the beginning of the crisis, it was 27 cents a piece. But because the government was making more, and they dropped the price to avoid anybody from hoarding the mask. And now it's 20 cents a piece. And now you could even order online, just go pick it up in your neighborhood 7-Eleven store. It's open 24 hours a day. So you basically, and they give you a map of the inventory of the mask of all the stores around you. So you never have to go, over a block to pick up your masks. And so, what had happened is that they had developed this integrated system between, the health system and integrate it with people's lives and make it easier for people. Now, for people under quarantine, they deliver food, 3 meals a day. They give them a book to read. So, hey, this book is going to calm you down. It's like a Buddha's book. I saw it. It's like they gave them a Buddha's book to read. And then they call them 2 or 3 times a day to check on their symptoms. And if people are getting sicker during quarantine, they will triage them through a special route into the hospital so they don't mingle with the other patients. They go through a special route. So this way, people feel that they've been taken care of. Quarantine is not so bad. And they pay them. Now they pay people under quarantine. I think it's like $33 a day if you stay in quarantine. So you surf the internet, you watch TV, and you get paid. So this is very different from what was happening during SARS. And then they communicate well. That's the third important point. Communications during the crisis. So as everybody knows, the vice president or the former vice president now is a very prominent epidemiologist, and he will go on the podium of the office of the president and basically teaching people how to wash hands, when to wear masks. And this was done at the highest level of government. And certainly the National Health Command Center, led by the Minister of Health, Chen Shizhong, who's very now a very popular figure because of how calm he is and how clearly he explains different things to the public, and he's extra patient, so that he answered every question of every reporter until there were no more questions, in such a way that I don't think anybody actually could say that they could do better than him, because it was done in such a way that really calms people. And so I think it's during the crisis, the communication and having the right type of leadership to communicate, I think is also very important. And so as of today, there are less than 450 cases in Taiwan and 7 deaths. And the schools are open. People go to work. And baseball season is here. People go watch baseball in the stadium. And so going forward, I think there are still some challenges. For example, they're trying to figure out when to open travel to Taiwan, because right now foreigners cannot go. and people who go there has to be quarantined for 14 days because of the imported cases recently, and there's been no domestic case for over 32 days. And there's a balance between the use of emergency powers and maintaining civil liberties. Now, from the Communicable Disease Control Act, their special power will expire next year. And so to summarize, I think this time, Taiwan had the right logic. They quickly realized that this is human-to-human transmission from the data they were seeing. They had done the right sequence of things. For example, the example of the masks. First, they tell people we don't have enough masks. Then they stop the exporting of it. Then they make more and they give it to people and then donate to the rest of the world. So that's the right sequence. They had the right tempo. They did things very quickly in the beginning that buys them time to be more deliberate later. And they articulated well in terms of communications. And so that is sort of my assessment of what Taiwan has done well this time. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Wang. That's an extraordinary story. I didn't know most of it. It's just amazing. And it testifies, I think, to, first of all, Taiwan's high technical capability. It's a country of experts like you and the former vice president, and secondly, to a high administrative capacity. And it sounds like political unity. So at the end of the other presentations, when we get to the Q&A, I want to come back to you and ask whether any of this was politically controversial among the political parties, or perhaps Vincent or Shirley may talk about that in their presentation. It's an amazing story, and as an American, I can only express my, what is the word, jealousy, my envy of what you have described. It's great. Okay, so now we're going to go to Vincent Wang, Professor Vincent Wang, who is the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences at Adelphi University and a professor of political science there. He got his undergrad degree from National Taiwan University. He has an MA from Johns Hopkins, SAIS, and a PhD in political science from the University of Chicago. And as I said, is now the Dean of College of Arts and Sciences at Adelphi in New York, and has many, many publications on Taiwan, among other subjects, as well as other Asian topics. So Professor Wang is going to talk to us about his analysis of how the Taiwan's handling of the COVID-19 crisis has affected its global status and its international participation. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you, Professor Nathan. Thank you for inviting me, and it's a pleasure to contribute to this very important and timely conversation. As Professor Jason Wang mentioned, that Taiwan, due to its geographical proximity and human exchange with mainland China, international analysts had previously predicted that Taiwan would be a heavy casualty for this COVID-19. In fact, we can draw a very quick comparison between 2019 and the 2003. I think that the 2003 SARS case showed that Taiwan was a collateral damage for the flaws in China's governance system, namely the propensity for local authorities to conceal bad information or inconvenient information, suppression of dissent or whistleblowing, the slow response, and of course, in the case of Taiwan's intent to participate in the World Health Organization, China's insistence on going through Beijing has actually caused a very inefficient and costly protocol for Taiwan. So Taiwan was a collateral damage for all the flaws of China as exhibited in 2003. As a consequence, Taiwan actually recorded the third highest number of cases and deaths only after China and Hong Kong in 2003. And in fact, was the very last one to be free from SARS. At that time, I was in Taiwan, and of course, was the last one to be able to travel internationally. And at that time, I just remember very distinctively, the World Health Organization only show its sympathy for Taiwan as quote unquote unlucky. But Taiwan learned a very valuable and should I say costly lesson from 2003 that this time we will not repeat the same mistake. And internationally, China's bungling of SARS and Taiwan's travails in 2003 added the moral support and the functional imperative for Taiwan to be incorporated in the global health system. However, it was not until 2009, in fact, almost 1 year after the KMT government went into power, which is more acceptable to China, that Taiwan was able to participate in the World Health Assembly, the WHO's decision-making body, in 2009 under the name Chinese Taipei. Of course, this is still far from a full-fledged membership or other forms of participation, but at least Taiwan was visible again in the WHA in 2009 until 2017. Of course, in 2016, the current government, the Democratic Progressive Party, DPP, came into power, which is less acceptable to China. And China worked behind the scene or before the scene to make sure that the previous invitation to Taiwan was withheld. Now, in 2019, as Jason mentioned, all these all these measures in place, and China exhibited its heavy hand, and Taiwan did not take China's word at its face value like last time in 2003, and so far has recorded what must be seen as a very exemplary record with COVID-19, or maybe a success story. This allows Taiwan to, in a way, punch above its weight, because Taiwan's model actually shows that there is an open, transparent, and democratic model, as opposed to China's heavy-handedness and authoritarian model. Also, after Taiwan has put its domestic condition under control, it is able to begin humanitarian assistance, such as face masks and other medical supplies to allies, partners, and friends. This has actually contrasted drastically with China's so-called face mask diplomacy, that China wants to not only rewrite the narrative about COVID-19, but also coerce other countries to thank China. Now, the COVID-19, in my view, has actually strengthened the case for greater international participation and heightened international role for Taiwan for 3 reasons. We can revisit these 3 reasons. First is that this experience underscores the inadequacy of the global community to fulfill a universalist principle with regard to Taiwan. Take WHO, for example. This UN specialized agency founded in 1948 in its constitution states that its main objective is the attainment of all peoples of the highest possible level of health. So it's all peoples and the highest level of health. As of 2016, the WHO has 194 member states. All of the member states of the United Nations, except for a few entities which many of our listeners might not be familiar with, such as Liechtenstein, a German-speaking microstate with a population just a little bit over 30,000, plus Cook Islands and Niue. I don't think that the people many people don't realize where they are. That the last time I checked, Niue has a population of 1,600, and they are in quote-unquote free association with New Zealand. But Cook Islands and Niue are actually members of WHO. And Taiwan has 23.4 million people. And obviously, in terms of population, the mandate of the WHO makes a more compelling case. Also, as of 2013, WHO has 2 associate members, Puerto Rico and Tokelau. Of course, these are dependencies with the United States and New Zealand. Several other countries have been granted observer status. Palestine is an observer as a quote-unquote national liberation movement recognized by the League of Arab States under the United Nations Resolution 3118. The Holy See also attends as an observer. And there is one last observer, which is the Order of Malta, which of course is a very rich European history. So the point here is that the WHO has over the years been able to accommodate a variety of political entities. In the case of Taiwan, of course, from 2009 to 17, Taiwan was an observer to the WHO. So the current debate is simply to restore Taiwan to its previous status. Therefore, we can say that Taiwan's exclusion is really a glaring hole for the concept of global governance. Global governance cannot be complete without Taiwan. The second point is about a functional necessity. WHO, just like other alphabet soup like WTO, which is World Trade Organization, or ICAO, International Civil Aviation Organizations, and so on, these functional bodies or specialized agencies actually regulate one issue area that does not imply much of the so-called high politics, issues of sovereignty that Beijing is most sensitive about when it comes to Taiwan. This is not like the United Nations General Assembly or the UN Convention on the Laws of the Sea. Just think for a moment. The World Trade Organization would be hobbled if the world's 16th largest trader and powerhouse in manufacturing, particularly information and communication technology, is not included. So WTO find a way to include Taiwan, which of course is as a separate customs under the name Taiwan, Penghu, Jinmen, Mazu, separate custom territory, or for short, Chinese Taipei. In this case, diseases know no boundaries and do not respect the reporting protocol. WHO, which is professed the highest attainment of health by all people, cannot fully fulfill its function without Taiwan. In other words, WHO's function is seriously undermined without Taiwan. And in fact, I have shown elsewhere that international organizations have been able to accommodate various entities. I think it will also surprise many people that Hong Kong and Macau and Puerto Rico have equal number or even greater number of international organization membership than Taiwan. So Taiwan's current international status obviously leaves much to be desired and seriously hamper the functions of these international organizations. The third point is that the current status quo has shown that the cost for excluding Taiwan in deference to China is actually increasing. It used to be that Taiwan bears all the costs. Every year, take WHO for example, every year that there will be some campaign, some lobbying and so on, there might be some debate, and then WHO would put on sort of a debate of 2 against 2, 2 in favor and 2 against. And then they argue that there's no consensus for including Taiwan. Therefore, this issue is put off for another year. In other words, most countries show indifference. But I'm going to argue that this kind of indifference is going to be increasingly costly, because as the COVID-19 case show, that many countries actually become victims of China's handling of the pandemic politics. They actually have an interest in how China is governed internally. They have an interest in investigating how the virus got started and how it was initially handled. In other words, China's internal politics become international concerns, and therefore they are also less sympathetic to China's sensitivity when it comes to Taiwan. I will argue that this growing cost is borne by the PRC as well, because the PRC has for years said that it wants to win the heart and mind of Taiwanese people. The way they have excluded Taiwan has only made the Taiwanese people further alienated from China. So in other words, China may have won the battle, but have lost the war. It is further and further away from reaching its own stated goal with respect to Taiwan. This time, there is growing international support. In fact, we should see a more international support for Taiwan's higher international status in terms of both scope and intensity. Scope means that more and more countries that will be more sympathetic to correcting all the abnormalities I mentioned earlier. Intensity means that they will find more ways to support Taiwan. Take the United States, for example. It used to be, the conventional wisdom used to be that the Taiwan Relations Act have regulated US-Taiwan relations for the last 40 years, and that on the international participation front, that the United States has basically taken a very passive stance. But in the last 2 years, the Congress has passed a series of pro-Taiwan legislation, and President Trump have signed into acts such as the Taipei Act and so on. And of course, the United States, this current administration is also interested in pushing China very hard, and if WHO becomes an arena for such a tussle. In addition to the United States, and now of course the United States, it actually has a legal obligation to help Taiwan maintain its diplomatic allies and to bolster its international participation. In addition to the United States, you see other countries like Japan, the European Union, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and so on, have actually spoken openly in favor of Taiwan, or have actually moved away from their previous passive stance. Some people argue that whether WHO is actually under too much Chinese influence and perhaps is pretty corrupt and or tone deaf to the legitimate demand of Taiwan, and maybe that the like-minded countries can establish a alternative organization, more like a NATO-like public health body of like-minded democracies, in which, of course, China would not be a part. Therefore, Taiwan would be rightfully included in there. It's an interesting idea. I don't know how far it will go. But of course, the Trump administration has said that has threatened to totally withdraw the funds and also the US participation in WHO. I will end with just a few cautionary tales. So on balance, the situation seems more favorable to Taiwan in 2019 as compared to 2003. However, there are a few countervailing trends we need to be mindful of. One, of course, is that in 2020, Chinese power and the influence is higher, is growing stronger than 2003. And there are also more Chinese nationals in international organization. The former Director General of WHO was Margaret Chan, was from Hong Kong. And of course, Chinese nationals now are at the helm of such organizations as ICAO, or Food and Agricultural Organization, and many others. And even the current Director General of WHO, Tedros, is said to be someone approved by China. So we need to be cognizant that Chinese influence is actually higher now than before. Also, we need to recognize that in many international organizations, states actually do not vote as individual states. They actually vote as a group. So this is called the group politics in IOs. So for example, China routinely can count on many votes from the developing countries, particularly from Africa. And just think about this for a moment, that in order for Taiwan to obtain a formal membership in the WHO, it will require a simple majority of the 194 votes of the current members. And China can probably command a majority given the current group politics in WHO. And one other caution is that the US-China relations are currently undergoing arguably a fundamental reassessment, and the relationship is probably at its nadir in the last 40 years. Ironically, that worsening US-China relations may actually weaken the American leverage over Chinese to make concessions on such quote-unquote, harmless issues like WHO. So I think the current situation, comparing Taiwan's former participation in WHO from 2009 to 2017 is a contrast. And finally, it also goes without saying that some kind of a cross-strait dialogue is necessary in order to advance Taiwan's international participation. The previous KMT government adheres to the so-called 1992 consensus, which is acceptable to China because they have China has its own version, which is basically a one China principle, although the KMT says one China, each side has its own interpretation. And the current government, DPP, the President Tsai Ing-wen, in her last inauguration speech, 2016, said that she respected the historical fact of the 1992 dialogue, conversation, and so on. And in 2020, she did not repeat that. Is it possible for the mainland and Taiwan to reach somewhere in between? In other words, the KMT version and the DPP version, somewhere in between, and that China find acceptable, therefore will lessen its opposition to Taiwan's international participation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vincent. That was great. That was very, very informative. One of the worries that I have is that as US-China relations worsen, Taiwan might become a kind of a football symbol, something that a tool in that fight, and it may suffer. So, I mean, of course, Taiwan wants US support, but if the US is supporting Taiwan just to bash China, I think this is sort of what you were also implying, that this could turn out to be dangerous for Taiwan. But let's talk about that afterwards. So now we're going to go to Shirley Lin, who is the Compton Visiting Professor in World Politics at the Miller Center of Public Affairs at the University of Virginia and a faculty member at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. But right now she's in Taiwan. And Shirley, I think you told me you've been there for the whole year. So you have seen everything. And we're very interested to hear what you've seen and also to get your analysis of the impact of these events on cross-strait relations as well as on China-US relations. So thank you, Shirley, for participating.
Thank you, Andy. It's great to be back at the Weatherhead Institute, albeit virtually, and honored, of course, to be online with Vincent and Jason. And as I predicted correctly, by the time they both finish, I probably don't have very much to add. And so I'm going to do a few things just to fill in the gap. First is to talk briefly about having been here for on and off 5 months, including taking a few flights, which really gave me a sense of how the policies are enforced, and to be like an eager fan, like every other Taiwanese, watching the health minister Chen Shizhong's daily briefing at 2 o'clock, which sometimes is off more than once, and I'm really amazed at Taiwanese people's resilience in this battle against coronavirus. The healthcare system is something I've been experiencing. I have had family in quarantine the last few months, taking care of a family member in ICU for many weeks. And then even today, a public health worker came to visit someone in our family. So I've been come into contact with healthcare system like never before. And life has really changed in Taipei. So I think going into every building, being taken temperature, everyone fully compliant, wearing a mask when you go into a government building, hospital, and now basically in most buildings, you would see very little public pushback. Very high level of acceptance of policy, but with transparency and full discussion. And I think this is where I would sort of headline the observation on the ground, which is coming from living both in Charlottesville and in Hong Kong, and now in Taipei. You can see why Taiwan has won so many awards, if you will, for the fight against COVID-19. It really shows that democracy can fight the pandemic. And this is not because people blindly follow policy, but of course, first they voted for this government in January in a landslide election, voting the Democratic Progressive Party into power for both the executive branch and the legislative branch. And then, of course, a big concern, I would say, from the start. The DPP was not actually doing very well in terms of domestic reforms and execution of those reforms in Taiwan's first term. Many of her reforms were long needed, but they were not executed thoughtfully, and the public policies needed more debate. And yet, during this pandemic, I think more so than any other, people have come together. And while they questioned the policy, discussed it, if you watch the health minister Chen's daily briefing, there are many, many questions coming from the journalists and the newspapers, reading the newspapers every day about what actually happens with the execution of these policies, really gives you a sense of how a democracy actually has a lot of strength. And it's not what I think some people have characterized Taiwan as being maybe a very compliant and Asian society, and that's why it has worked. But I would say on the contrary, people have resisted and have discussed the policy, but complied to work together as a community to benefit others and themselves. And so on the ground, I have many more stories, which I'd be happy to go into as I go into the second point that I think the two previous panelists didn't have time to cover. So I think relations with the mainland, it's very interesting. The most interesting fact, of course, is acting fast and ahead of the spread of the virus is the key. And both of our speakers, two previous speakers talked about it. But the reason this has happened is also serendipity. Rising tension in the Taiwan Strait during Tsai's first term and completely extended into her second term unintentionally benefited Taiwan because China had been restricting individual and group tourists from visiting Taiwan since 2016. And more dramatically, up to Taiwan's 2020 presidential election.
Shirley, I think your picture went off. Maybe you can, there you go. Thank you.
Okay.
We want to see you.
So were you able to hear me?
Yeah, we heard you, and now we see you. Thanks.
Okay, great. Sorry. So the more dramatically, up until the 2020 presidential election, in order to influence Taiwanese choice in the election, more tourists were cut off, and as a result, there were fewer people crossing the Taiwan Strait. So this was, of course, a good start. But the restrictive flow before government even imposes border control still had its impact on the economy, which I'll talk about as my third point. So the importance of Taiwan as a young democracy is that even though it seems very polarized during the election, during the campaigns, and if you watch the presidential and legislative elections, there were some nasty exchanges. However, once it's concluded, people accepting who's in power and following policy, and this, I think, shows that a highly competitive political system can also bring about a strong sense of social solidarity and national identity, especially when it is threatened. And this is, of course, the focus of my research. When we talk about threat, we think about 9/11 in the US, we think about the Soviet Union during the Cold War, but a threat like COVID-19 is perhaps deadlier and more able to unite people to come together. And I think Taiwanese have never been more proud of their country because they trust each other, they trust the government, and the government also trusts them. And that is something that's quite different when there's just top-down policy and people have to listen to the government. And of course, that contrast is China, how it has been able to also fight the pandemic efficiently in a totally different way, where you see people trying to defy the policy and run away to get out of the lockdown. But this is not something that we can take for granted. As we see the last few months, I see how people have evolved. In the last few weeks, people have started to come out and things are more normal. But what I want to highlight is on Wednesday, Tsai Ing-wen had an inauguration speech. And let's look at the two speeches. Wednesday was Tsai Ing-wen, and today and yesterday, Beijing had its most important part of meetings, the two sessions as is well known. If you look at Tsai Ing-wen's speech, I give it a thumbs up because she started to focus on the pandemic by holding it on the grounds of Taipei Guest House, not the front of the presidential office. It is to avoid crowds, to avoid any spread of the virus. In particular, I like how she focused on using Taiwan's competitive advantage to achieve continued growth and to promote Taiwan's participation in the international community. But I love how she honed in on the dignified way Taiwanese have united to fight the pandemic and achieve a sense of community with shared destiny. Now, she's, as most people know, not a very spontaneous or emotional speaker normally, very smart and articulate, but this time she pointed out individuals who are sitting there, who are heroes of this fight, and they were there. This underscores the feelings, I think, of many people here on the island for the last 120 days who have been threatened by the pandemics. Threatened because long before other countries saw it coming, they were already subsumed by it. And not only that, they were scared because Taiwan is not a member of the WHO. And just like during SARS, Taiwan may not be able to get relief or information from other countries, much less from China, which was the origin of this virus. So during this fight, I think Taiwanese really felt Beijing's aggressive attitude toward Taiwan and the Taiwanese people, not just the DPP, which had just voted. Of course, the people had just voted for Tsai and for her second term. So marginalizing Taiwan during 2003 and 2020 really impressed the Taiwanese that Beijing is not only against the government, which you can understand, they were never fond of, but also they didn't care about Taiwanese people's lives. So Tsai mentioned that, quote, the Taiwanese people have the kindest heart in the entire world. I think this is what really struck me. In the last few weeks, Taiwanese have donated 17 million masks to other countries, which really reflects the desire of Taiwanese to be part of the community and to contribute to the world in global health. Now, I've been lining up to get masks all these last few weeks. And in recent weeks, as Jason said, you can now get, every 2 weeks, you can get 9 masks for an adult. And I can easily also, just using an app, give it away. So the country, actually Taiwan, can give it to other countries that need it. And it's been giving away masks to the 15 allies and the United States. Many states in the United States have received large number of masks. So with the pandemic as the context, her approach in her speech on Wednesday to portray China coming back to cross-strait relations as the actor that wants to change the status quo unilaterally. And the need for effective asymmetrical defense strategies, I think, are to be noted. She called Beijing to find a way to coexist with Taiwan on the basis of parity, peace, parity, democracy, and dialogue. And it was calling on China to not change the status quo. She also mentioned that the Beijing authorities' use of one country, two systems to downgrade Taiwan and undermine the cross-strait status quo is unacceptable. Now, this is, of course, very important in light of what happened today. Yesterday and today, we hear from Beijing at the annual meeting of China's top political body, the Chinese Communist Party has imposed a sweeping national security law on Hong Kong by fiat, which criminalizes foreign interference along with secessionist activities and subversion of state power. This has seriously damaged one country, two system, and of course, really diluted Hong Kong's autonomy, eroded Hong Kong's autonomy. Socioeconomically, of course, many of the problems that Taiwan faces today as a high-income society in what I call a high-income trap were also mentioned. The need for tighter social security net, for need for the elderly should be met, and more integration with the global economy. But some were missing that also relates to how Taiwan has become more and more integrated with China. For example, inequality, widening inequality in Taiwan. So all of this takeaway is everybody was holding their breath to see if Beijing would be provoked. Of course, you can imagine, even before Beijing has its meeting yesterday and today, naturally the answer is yes. It doesn't really matter what Taiwan says. They were going to be provoked because she, in 2016, had already refused to say what Beijing wants her to say. And of course, she tries her best to reflect what the Taiwanese people believe. And today, there are very few takers in Taiwan for the 92 consensus, which basically agrees that unification is the ultimate goal of the two sides. So I think Tsai's speech was balanced and well thought out, especially because Taiwan is now going to have trouble in a fracturing global economy. And is there any way to accommodate Taiwan? Well, let's look quickly now at what Beijing says. So Beijing decided to say very little about Taiwan. And this is very, maybe surprising, maybe not. But I think Beijing has decided, as most of us have predicted, to harden its rhetoric toward Taiwan, removing references for the first time to peaceful reunification in its annual work report. So observers say, of course, this change reflects the stronger stance Beijing will adopt in tackling the Taiwan issue, which is one of its key national interests. Now, all of this change is a minor point compared to what has happened to Hong Kong just in the last few hours. So I think that most importantly, let's move into Taiwan, of course, is in cross-strait relations, really in the context of deteriorating US-China relations. And all eyes were on whether there would be an olive branch or some kind of speech in the last 2 days that shows that Beijing would like to perhaps take a softer approach to US-China relations. And the question, of course, is there really a paradigm shift in cross-strait relations or in US-China relations? Now, I think that in the shadow of rising US-China tension under Trump, Taiwan has become very important. It's an important member of the Indo-Pacific strategy. It's leading as an emerging democracy in Asia-Pacific, in fighting the pandemic, showing people what good governance can be. And as Deputy National Security Advisor Matt Pottinger reminded us in his congratulatory remarks on Wednesday to President Tsai, which was in Chinese, that she won more votes, that she was the most highly supported president in Taiwan's history, and it shows how, as a democracy, a Chinese society can be democratic and be free. So to say this is come back to the virus, to say the coronavirus has prompted a paradigm shift, I think is an exaggeration. What it has done is accelerated a deteriorating relationship between the US and China that was in, I would say, a competitive and somewhat cooperative relationship in the last 30 years. However, it is now in a comprehensive rivalry in all arenas. And yet, there is a paradigm shift. But however, on US-Taiwan relations, I think that it is still working within the One China policy, in that while the US and other allies are very supportive of Taiwan, and as Vincent has mentioned, should be joining the WHO annual meeting as an observer, it is not trying to help Taiwan join as a member. That would be a change in One China policy. So I think that the United States is carefully weighing how to support Taiwan in this changing global landscape while not really completely moving away from the One China policy. Now, there is something that's very important, of course, is that you could see both Mike Pompeo as well as Joe Biden congratulating President Tsai. So there is something that's important, is that I think both on the Republican and the Democrat side, there's bipartisan support for what Taiwan is experiencing and for Taiwan. And this is probably the highest level of support for Taiwan since its democratization. As for China, it may be seeing the highest level of antagonism since 1989 Tiananmen. So does that mean it's an opportunity or a threat for Taiwan? Well, it's absolutely both. If you look at the challenge for Taiwan, it's always been in this double bind, as I call it. It has to work closely with China economically. There is no choice. But it has to be very autonomous in order to protect its way of life and its democracy that it values so highly. So the government has rolled out economic stimulus package of over $35 billion in anticipation of worsening economic conditions. Now, the effect of the virus and interrupted supply chains was offset by a boost in domestic production for products in semiconductor and telecommunications. And so export was very high. So the first quarter actually looked okay. But this is not to say that global demand is going to decline and is going to hit the manufacturers, the technology manufacturers in Taiwan very hard. So while the government is still predicting close to 2% growth, IMF says -4%. I think that a recession is inevitable. Even if Taiwan outperforms others, which it did in 2019, outperforming this year could be you're just less negative than everybody else. And so what does that really mean? It means that Taiwanese government has to govern even better because there will be trade-offs to be made. Are we going to take care of the young who don't have jobs or the elderly who need more health care? And in this pandemic, that will actually be an even harder choice to make. So I think that in conclusion, Taiwan's being squeezed by this deteriorating U.S.-China relations. The last few days, news about TSMC investing in the U.S. also underscores how technology companies are going to have to choose sides between selling to Huawei or focusing on the U.S. market with new export control policy. So Taiwan is in a tough place. Taiwan's China dilemma will not go away. And the pandemic underscores some wonderful things about how Taiwan's emerging as a new democracy, but also highlights the increasingly difficult challenges ahead.
Thank you, Shirley. That was, again, a great presentation. And I wonder if you could go down to the 7-Eleven and get me some masks and send them over here. We don't have enough. I assume Jason and Vincent have their sources. I don't have any. Okay, that's really great. One thing I want to pick up on, we have some questions from listeners, which I'll get to in a minute. But one of the questions from the listener, from Ian Zellinger, tags on to something I wondered as well. I think I heard you say, Shirley, that everybody pulled together in the public sphere, everybody pulled together and complied with all of the requirements that you and Jason were describing. Ian's question is, were there any cases where the people broke the triage and violated quarantine or were impossible to locate? So was there resistance? And then my related question to that, which I already posed to Jason, and this would be for any of you who want to answer, is at the political level. So from the popular level, was there any resistance? You know, you would think human nature being what it is, there would always be some.
I guess I'll take that on and I'll...
Okay, but let me pose my related question, which is then
yes.
At the political level, was there any politicization of this? It's hard for me to imagine, you know, Tsai Ing-wen comes out with all of her administration to lay down these policies. There's always criticism, right? I mean, it's the job of the opposition, in fact, to pick holes. Are you guys saying there wasn't any politicization? There was no political criticism? So Shirley, go ahead.
Okay, I'll take both actually very quickly. I'm sure others will add more, but first of all, there's definitely resistance. So to say people are 100% compliant would be ridiculous. But every time somebody breaks the quarantine and runs off to get to go to the night market to eat, and they sneak out of their house and get caught, the television evening news show and show how much they had to pay in penalty. And, you know, it's just total humiliation for the individual. So it's both carrots and sticks. It's not as if everyone is so happy to comply, so happy to be socially isolated, and so happy to be in quarantine. But when people do break the law, for example, if you get into a taxi, you have to wear a mask. And if you don't, the driver would ask you to get off the taxi, which has happened to me. So I know that feeling. But people don't get dragged out by security guards. So there's a part of it that I think makes the non-compliant culture very interesting. But to come back to the politicalization, of course, the opposition has already been saying part of all of this is that the U.S. is also getting very closer to Taiwan in helping Taiwan fight the pandemic. And the KMT has been saying even before the election that the DPP is getting too close to the U.S., which is actually putting Taiwan in danger. And so the pandemic, how does it relate to the pandemic, is several people, I would say in the opposition, have been saying that mass diplomacy is just a waste of money, is spending resources on other people when we actually don't have enough, or is just diverting people's attention from other failed policies. So that's what I would say about the politicization of this issue.
Jason, do you want to say anything about that?
Sure, I'll just add a couple of things. So, there was this one incident where, the Buddha, Taiwan has this famous Buddha Mazu, and every year the Buddha will go around Taiwan. It's like the largest movement of people in Taiwan when the Buddha gets from one temple to another in Taiwan. And so they were planning on this massive Buddha tour, the religious organizations. And the government was very worried because at the time, it's unclear, how much community spread there was at that time. So again, this takes a lot of political leadership and skill. So the minister basically was talking to the religious leaders, and the minister didn't want to ban it because it's quite a popular event, but was telling people how dangerous this might be when people aggregate like that. And then finally, the minister, I think, communicated this message that, do you really want the Buddha to worry? That's very skilled. Because it didn't say Buddha would want you to do this or that, Buddha will want you to rotate or not. But it says, do you really want to make the Buddha worry? And that by itself, the religious leaders have to back down because so that's another example of leadership in this case. And I think not everybody could do that. Certainly not every people holding political office will have that kind of emotional quotient, EQ, to make it happen. And so there were cases like that where because this is a very experienced team, the current administration has many people that are experienced in fighting sort of pandemics and epidemics. And so, and the communication is a key piece.
Vincent, do you want to say anything around?
Sure, just very briefly. So you asked about whether there is any politicization over the handling of the pandemic. I think to begin with, a sort of a proverbial, you never let a crisis go to waste, right? So the ruling party overall has handled the pandemic very well. And I think that this is actually, and not only because they are the ruling party, they learned from 2003, but also I think that this COVID thing may actually mark a milestone in terms of Taiwan's body politic. Let me explain why. It used to be that Taiwan voters believe that the KMT was better at governing. After all, they were a long-time ruling party, and they were particularly good at economic affairs because Taiwan was one of the four tigers in economic growth and all that. And then, as Shirley mentioned, that the DP barely 16 months ago, the DPP suffered a huge electoral defeat in the 9-1 municipal elections, largely on popular dissatisfaction about domestic issues, particularly reform and so on. But the way the DPP government handles pandemic actually shows that they can actually govern very well. This is actually, I think this will have a profound impact on the mind of Taiwanese people. It used to be for lack of a better term, you choose sense or sensibility. If you choose sense, you vote for KMT. If you choose sensibility, you vote for DPP because it stands up for Taiwan identity and so on. But now the DPP shows that you can also trust the DPP when it comes to sense.
Great, thank you. I want to ask Jason, you gave such a great description of how Taiwan learned from the SARS crisis. did the mainland learn the same things from the SARS crisis that Taiwan learned? Did it also set up a command center? Did it also stockpile necessary, resources? Did it deploy technical experts and administrative experts in order to be prepared, so that this time we saw that at the beginning the local authorities in Wuhan covered it up, but after that, did mainland China demonstrate some of the same lessons learned that Taiwan had demonstrated?
So I would say that these are very different countries and to some extent very different societies as it has evolved over the last 70 years. And so Taiwan and mainland has been separately governing for the last 70 years, since the year my mother was born. And so as people have developed into different systems, their reactions are very different. And the local government's relationship with the central government are also very different. So during SARS, for example, the Taipei local government is different from the central government. The central government was DPP. Local government at that time was KMT, and there's some fighting. But in this case, in China, the communication between local government and central government, I think perhaps there was a little delay. And one of the reasons why Taiwan took proactive action this time was that it's not just SARS, right? In the last 20 years, we have seen SARS, swine flu, avian flu twice, and COVID-19. So it's every 3 to 5 years, you're going to have a pandemic or epidemic. And so at the start of the epidemic, you need the virus, okay? You need to know if it's human to human transmission. And you need the virus. Why do you need the virus? You need the virus to develop the test for the virus. You need the virus to develop treatments and vaccines. So it's very important to get to it really early, because the virus sometimes grows exponentially. It's not linear. It's 2 to 4 to, to 8 to 16. So every day you're delaying, it goes, exponentially. And so right now, for example, that's another point why I think Taiwan should be in the WHO, because there's 1 million people working or living in China right now from Taiwan. And a lot of the doctors in the weekends, they take a flight, they will go from Taiwan to different cities in China to see patients, because there's a lack of some subspecialties in China. And so they are actually taking a pulse of what's happening in China with respect to disease surveillance. When you have all the doctors going to China in the weekends, they kind of know what's going on there. And so, the Chinese political system is very complex. I don't really understand it. But what I know is that you really need to have a good pulse on when there's a disease breaking out in any part of China, because people live very close to animals in China. And that's when the genes from the viruses will jump from, animals to humans, and then during recombination or reshuffling of the genes, then a new virus will come out. And so that's why I think it's important to do that. I'm not entirely clear what sort of, in this particular pandemic, what happened. And I think, many people will want to know if you have to do, in the hospital, we do mortality mobility reports on cases that didn't go well. And then you try to find out the root cause of what happened. And I think, I think the Chinese government will do that. They will try to figure out, because it's to protect the citizenry of their people as well.
We only have 15 minutes left. I want to, we had a question that I'm not going to post to you guys because I think it's been answered already, but I just want to acknowledge that one of our listeners, Yuki Nishimura, asked about the relationship between the WHO and Taiwan. I think that Vincent has covered it. I want to throw 2 more questions at Jason that came from listeners. One of them is relatively straightforward. Is it environmentally friendly to handle the medical waste and garbage if we dispose PPEs as fast as you're describing that it was done? And the other question is a little complicated, so let me read it to you from Jessica Kung. She says, one of the strong arguments the United States used for advocating Taiwan's participation in the WHO is that Taiwan notified the WHO about human-to-human transmission of COVID-19 as early as December 31st, but the WHO rebuffed such a claim. When pressured, Taiwan officials showed the content of the email sent to the WHO, and in the email, there was no mention of human-to-human transmission. It used atypical pneumonia to describe the disease. So her question is all atypical pneumonia the result of person-to-person transmission? If not, then didn't Taiwan damage its credibility by claiming that it had told the WHO that there was person-to-person transmission? Do you follow that question? Okay.
Yes, I do. And, you know, I read that email as well. And for a doctor, it's very obvious. It's sort of one of the jargons. So you describe somebody as atypical pneumonia as being isolated. That means this person could give it to another person. Otherwise, there's no reason to isolate it. And if you're describing atypical pneumonia, usually it's you get in it from another person. So you wouldn't describe you wouldn't need to isolate if you're getting from an animal, because there are no chickens, there are no pigs, there are no bats in the hospital. So or there are no anteaters in the hospital. So you don't expect people to need to isolate one individual from another. So it's just medical jargon, and I think they could have written it in more clear way. I agree, but as a medical doctor, if you read that, you say, "Oh man, I gotta be careful. This is human-to-human transmission." Yeah.
And then on the question of disposing of PPEs, how is it done in an environmentally responsible way?
That's a great question. And I think in the future, we're going to move into shields. Because first of all, PPEs, if you have a shield, you could wipe it down. And before when people started to wear masks, I don't know if people remember, even just like a month or two ago, the CDC was advising people not to wear masks. The WHO was advising people not to wear masks until there are studies that are coming out that this could be aerosol in addition to being a droplet. And so that means, virus could hang out. And so as evidence change, you need to change your practice. And so now everybody's wearing masks, but some people are wearing sort of a cloth mask they make from home, right? And I think that's pretty good for a regular folk. But if you're a doctor seeing patients, you need a N95 mask to make sure that you're not getting the virus and then give it to other patients. So different people will wear different type of mask, and I think some of them should be able to get reused, like cloth mask. But it's a very good question.
Thank you. Now I have a question for Shirley and Vincent, partly coming from a listener and partly coming from me. My version of this question is to say that when I read President Tsai's inaugural address, where she talks about stockpiling and strategic industries and defense reform and so on and so forth, these ideas are not exactly new. I mean, she used to have, I think she still has a Go South policy, and even that's not new because even Li Denghui and Chen Shui-bian had a policy. But the question that I'm interested in is, to what extent is Taiwan seeking to decouple from the mainland? Shirley mentioned the dependency of Taiwan's economy on the mainland, and it has always seemed to me that it's really impossible for Taiwan to, diminish that vulnerability. But do you think she's seeking to sort of use, as Vincent said, never waste an opportunity? Is she seeking to use the opportunity of this crisis to really ramp up the autonomy of Taiwan's economy from the mainland, to diminish dependency, the way that the Trump administration seems to be wanting to do with the American economy? Is that her policy, and can it work? And so Sarah Liu has sent in a question which I think is related to what I just said. She says, To Professor Wang and Lin, what do you think the role of the evolution of Taiwan government's attitude against Beijing has been in the fight of the pandemic? Actually, she has a series of questions. I don't know if you'll have time to answer them all. Is there any difference between President Chun and President Tsai in this respect? Because it seems that the democracy has been kept at the same level, and Professor Wang said that China's internal policy becomes an international concern. So I'd like you to talk about the relationship between Taiwan's position against the communist regime and the success you've made in the pandemic. Well, that's a lot of questions, but maybe within all of that package of things, you would find a few things to inform us.
Maybe I'll start with just the fact, because I've been here following the economy. The fact of the matter is actually Taiwan's trade with China has increased by 4% during this pandemic. So the interdependence between Taiwan and China, and the fact that is likely to continue unabated, but being more balanced and measured, if you will, diversified, is very important. As you can see with the pandemic, basically supplies cannot be guaranteed, especially coming out of China. And the reason the last quarter Taiwan's export was strong was also because factories in China opened, Taiwanese factories. And so the two economies are really, really intertwined. Of course, Taiwan is very small in terms of compared to China, and in terms of investments in China now, it cannot compare to the total amount of foreign direct investment from the world. But I think what you're asking, so that's the first part. And the second is, I don't think personally President Tsai is trying to decouple. That is a very ambitious term. And I don't think Trump would want to say that himself either, although that's up to everyone's interpretation. But decoupling is actually has happened historically. I think in the case of Taiwan, what the government is merely trying to do, and I think for both the opposition and the ruling party now, is to preserve a strong Taiwanese identity, because that is the only way to address what young people are feeling against increasing Chinese pressure, like the pressure of fighting the pandemic alone, without any recognition in the world, without being a member of anything. And yet, at the same time, to integrate more closely with the Chinese market to address the severe economic problems produced by Taiwan's high-income trap, which is aging demographic. There's just fewer people. There's no consumption and rising inequality. So I think that any government that cannot sort of walk this tightrope is going to lose the Taiwanese, is going to not be able to have legitimacy in the eyes of Taiwanese voters. But what President Tsai had been trying to do since her first term is to diversify and to go more towards Southeast Asia, which frankly has a good demographic and also very high growth, as China is slowing down. If you look at China's growth this year in Hong Kong, Taiwan is a star. So to be completely tied to the Chinese economy can be very dangerous, and no country should be so tied to such a large neighbor in a way that makes, and the pandemic has underscored how dangerous that could be. So I think it would be an exaggeration to say that the DPP's paradigm is to decouple from China. But as you can see, as the U.S. perhaps decouples, for example, in forcing TSMC basically not to supply Huawei anymore, this is going to create a market situation. And I think this is the other thing about Taiwanese government. The last 30 years, no government leads the market. The market really shapes the government. The government in Taiwan reflects simply the will of the people. And that includes the business community, which has a very strong, just like American companies in China, Taiwanese companies in China have been squeezed, have been in a very difficult situation, and they want some kind of a balancing act. And so a lot of Taiwanese companies have actually returned to Taiwan to invest. Yet, I think that's fluid.
So is it decoupling? I'm more of the opinion that it is actually diversification. As the old saying, that it is not wise to put all the eggs in one basket. However, I think that the situation now is a little bit different. To start with, when you have close to 40% of your exports going to the same destination directly or indirectly, it is a very large part of your livelihood. So it's very, very difficult to decouple. The reason and of course, up until now, the Taiwanese businessman's main contribution to the mainland is primarily what I call the vertical integration, namely that much of the cross-strait trade is actually intra-industry or intra-firm trade. So as China becomes more ambitious to go upstream in terms of its economic activities and go after those high-value sectors, for example, China 2025, its use for Taiwanese businesses and other businesses will actually reduce. So China, in that sense, will actually need Taiwanese businessmen less, at least not the kind of businessmen that as in the past. And of course, Taiwan should sensibly diversify to other markets such as Southeast Asia or the United States, Japan, and Europe, and so on. And I think that given the geopolitics of U.S.-China rivalry, that's one other impetus for Taiwan to diversify its economy more. So combined with all these, I think it is probably a pretty conscious strategy to diversify, but it's impossible to decouple.
Thank you both. I guess we have a short time for a last question about misinformation about COVID in Taiwan. So the questioner says, over the last few months, we've seen that online misinformation about COVID-19 has become a problem in the US. Maybe this is for Shirley. Has this been a problem in Taiwan, and what have they been doing to combat it?
Yes, I think as a democracy under attack, Taiwanese are very sensitive to fake news. Most people know that news are not completely reliable. And this helped the community, I think, to fight the virus, to resist misinformation and trust official information. So I think there is a real sensitivity to what's good information, what's not. But there are many examples of strange things that have happened. For example, early on, there were flights from China which carry people back from Wuhan, and there were rumors that there were infected people who were put on the plane deliberately by the Chinese government. And this, of course, spread like mad, you can imagine. This kind of situation episodes, if you will, come and go. But I think Taiwan is a little bit different than the United States. Of course, with the Russian hack and all sorts of things, everyone is becoming more sensitive to it now. But I think Taiwanese know that if they don't fight the virus well, which also means understanding what's correct information and what's not. And of course, to be honest, the President Tsai is not drinking anything strange. So there isn't as if there's public officials who say things that need a lot of correction. I think the Taiwanese are pretty trusting of their officials and what's been said. So it hasn't been quite an issue. The real issue is some of the information I think people receive, they think could be coming from a mainland Chinese server that spreads wrongful information. But no episode really has really garnered any attention.
Thank you very much. Well, we're out of time. I want to thank the Taipei Economic and Cultural Office for co-sponsoring with the Weatherhead East Asian Institute. I want to thank our listeners out there and those who raised questions, and especially to thank these three really wonderful panelists, Dr. C. Jason Wang from Stanford University, Vincent Wang from Adelphi University, and Shirley Lin from the University of Virginia and the Chinese University of Hong Kong for very, very informative remarks that answered a lot of questions for us. Thanks to all three of you.